So last time we left off with the Chosen telling us their questions. And the first question they had was, how do you develop products to sell? So if you guys want to go back up, and we'll finish your questions. And then, so we did, the last time we did erasable ink, the Chosen. So we'll finish theirs, and hopefully we'll get through these today. So what was your second question, and what's your justification?
So the second one was what type of products are the hardest to sell, and then kind of the secondary question was what adjustments do you make in your selling approach to sell those harder sell products?
Okay, all right. And what adjustments? So you've got a follow-up. All right, so what this is a question, obviously this will be dependent on if you interview somebody that sells in a field where they have a range of products. And most businesses sell more than one product, and they sell a range of products. And also usually with those, one of the things that you want to recognize is that they also usually sell services associated with those products. And how do you sell the service as opposed to the product itself? So most products are a combination of the product and service. So for those people that want to go into medical device sales, for example, obviously there's the sale of the medical device, so the oncology machine or whatever it is that my sister-in-law is selling these days. And then obviously those things have to have maintenance done to them, because when you have moving parts and things like that, they break. So I think that's a really good question. And then how do you adjust to that? I think is a great follow-up question to elicit, further response. So I think that's a good question. All right, so what's your third question?
I would say where are the problems within the company, and then what are their strengths, try to figure out what they need, and then advise them what they need. And then show them you don't have experience with help, especially help other people.
Okay, all right, I think that's a good question, particularly if you are specifically interested in that company. If this is a company that you're looking at, so you want to go into sales and you want to go into medical device sales, and you go to, I don't know, Johnson & Johnson or something like that, figuring out what are the problems within the company? What's the company culture? One thing that you might use to follow up with that, or what is the company culture like? So there are lots of different cultures out there. One of the companies that offers payroll. So in Oklahoma City, one of our graduates started this company that you may have heard of, and now the athletic enhancement facility is named after Paycom. It's the Paycom facility. So the founder of Paycom actually is a UCO grad. There are other companies like Paycom that offer payroll processing. You can probably heard of some of them. ADP is probably the largest and the oldest, but there's also you probably have heard ads on the radio if you listen to the radio for, how many of you heard Patriot Software?
No.
You've not heard of Patriot Software? Listen to any of the radio stations and they advertise. It's the guy who says, I had a small business once and I didn't realize that I was filing all these taxes wrong and I got hit with a big fine. So I decided small business needed a new software that could help with their payroll. Patriot Software. So, those are three different companies that offer, and I will tell you that all three of them have radically different cultures than the other. They're all in the same industry, but you might want to investigate company culture as well with that to determine, if this is the industry I want, which company is going to be the best in terms of my fit. So, which one has the most flexibility, the best benefit package, things like that. All right, so I think that's a good question. Your fourth question?
I would say if you're in the situation where you make a sale or there's interest in the product that you're selling or the services, what the timeline would be for a follow-up meeting.
Oh, okay, that's a good question. What is the sales cycle in your industry? That's going to be critically important, particularly if you're dependent upon commission, and if you're going into an industry where the sales cycle is, in educational sales, the sales cycle is generally a year or more. to get a sale. So I think that's an excellent question. So what is the sales cycle? How quickly do you follow up? I think that's a great question to ask. All right, and your final question.
What are some of the challenges you face in the line of work and how do you cope with them?
Okay, got to speak up so that the microphone can pick you up. What is it?
What are some of the challenges you face in the line of work and how do you cope with them?
Okay, what are the challenges in the line and how do you cope? I think the how do you cope is really an important one because it is a stressful career. There are lots of careers that you can choose that are less stress than sales. And so I think coping is really important. And how do you achieve, one thing that you might use as follow-up is how do you achieve work-life balance? And that's tough for a lot of salespeople because they are generally highly motivated by money. And I'm sure I'll tell you this more than once, but redundancy is good. When they do surveys of what it is that motivates people in work, money is always about the 7th or 8th thing that people say is most important to on the list of things that are most important. You would think that since work is, we need it for money, you would think that money would be the number one motivator. For most people, it's not their number one motivator. Their number one motivator is, I find creative expression, or I find an outlet that a company that I enjoy, or things like that. That's not true for salespeople. The money motivator is much higher on salespeople's list than it is for other types of employees. And that can be difficult to deal with because sales is the one area that you can go into and you can determine your own salary. If you want to make more money, you just go out there and do what? Sell more. Right? So that's one of the things. So I think those are all good questions. All right, good deal. So the chosen is gone. All right, round of applause. Which group wants to go next? All right, go ahead. What's your group name?
The Ridiculous Six.
The Ridiculous Six.
What was that? Yeah, it was that. So.
It was that, or it's not that?
I guess it is. It's still that, but one of our group members is missing.
Oh, okay. Well,
Oh, good.
all right, just right on time.
Guys, I want to do the first question.
So our first question would be, what are some examples of problems that you face as a salesperson and how are you able to solve them?
Okay.
Justification would be, we are able to learn problem-solving skills and tricks often used in the industry with, like, let's say, health. This machine, like, spoke as like the oncology machine. This is actually more effective and more efficient, uses a lot less resources, and it processes everything a lot quicker so you can get to your patient and more patients as the day goes on.
Okay. All right, so I think that's an important one. With regard to problems, that is going to be largely industry or context specific. So, I mean, that's a great question. If you've really decided that this is an industry that you want to go into, to drill down on, where do you see the trends going in your industry? There are industries that, are not growing a whole lot. What are some of the industries that are not necessarily growing right now in sales?
So like normal like retail stores.
Okay, that's a big one. Retail stores had a really good year this year at Christmas time, except for Macy's, and there was one other that didn't have a good one. But overall, Amazon is really replacing that. So if you think about things like Dillard's, how is it that you differentiate, and how is it that your company plans on remaining relevant? Things that I never thought people would buy. I never thought I would buy, for example. I never thought I would buy clothing online. I now buy almost all of my clothing online.
Wow.
And I never thought I would do that. I've always thought clothes are the one thing where you can't do it, but I buy lots of my clothes online because it's easy to send it back if it doesn't fit. So I'm buying, most of my dress shirts and stuff, actually I buy from a company in England and they ship them across the pond. So Yeah. I like French cuff shirts, so it's hard to find French cuff shirts. The British like French cuff shirts, so I buy them. But I never would have thought, 15 years ago that I could buy shirts, online, but you can. All right, your next question.
Our next question is, what kind of mindset do you put yourself in before you begin selling? And does it change customer to customer or business to business?
Okay.
Our justification is that it shows what steps a salesperson puts themselves in immediately prior to a sale and what strategies they apply.
Okay.
Also, it helps us determine what kind of mindset we should have and how it varies and how adaptable our mindset varies from person to person who sells sales and how to read it.
Okay, I think that's a great question. Also, one that you could use as a follow-up or as another question to that is, how do you deal with, everybody has bad days. How do you get into that mindset if you are having a really bad day? I mean, everybody has days where, they wake up and the kids are sick and their spouse yells at them and the car battery's dead and you just want to crawl back in bed. And how do you change your mindset to get into, that? How do you go motivate yourself? Sorry about that. I thought I turned that. Nope, go off. All right. Hopefully it won't come back up while you're standing there. Okay. Your third question.
We wrote down, how do you explain what your company does to someone unfamiliar with your industry or your company?
Okay.
Our justification is it not only helps us learn more about the interviewer and their company, but it also helps us see the company through their perspective and how they like to explain it.
Okay. Do you think that's going to be more relevant to the B2B context or the B2C context?
Probably more B2C context.
Why do you think it's B2C context?
Because when business to business goes into each other, they usually do a lot more of their research, and so they know probably about as much as the interviewee.
And you probably have a limited number of suppliers, and
Right.
and unless you're selling office supplies or something like that, in the B2B context, you probably know who the suppliers are. I mean, if you are a restaurant, for example, and I think I told you all, my family has a business, and so I help run that business. And as part of that, we have food service. There's not a lot of choices in terms of suppliers for restaurant. There's US Foods and there's Cisco. And that's about it. Unless you want to go, I think there's a restaurant like Oklahoma Restaurant Supply or something like that down on 23rd Street. But yeah, so it's usually they know. However, that's not necessarily true if it's an emerging industry where you might need something new. So for example, when I first started teaching, I've been here 27 years, a long time. Not every professor had a computer. We sure didn't have a learning management system. I mean, we still had chalkboards when I started teaching. Imagine that. And I wish they'd go back to the chalkboards. I like chalkboards as opposed to dry erase boards. But, professors put their stuff on, they had these overhead projectors. You all don't even remember these.
I do.
And we make transparencies and put your transparencies on an overhead projector and use a chalkboard. Things have changed in the industry. So you might, if it's a new industry that's emerging, have to explain. But I think it's more relevant to the B2C context, probably. All right, your fourth question?
Fourth question is, how do you set goals or track progress to ensure performance from or your team? And our justification for this is similar to some of our previous questions, shows more methodology and communication tools and strategies that salespeople apply.
Okay, all right. I think that's a good question. This question would be really great if you are interviewing not just a salesperson, but a sales manager, in terms of how do they manage the process? What is it? How do you manage? And managing salespeople, if you get somebody who's a sales manager or has a management role, is tricky. It's generally more difficult unless they're selling suits at Dillard's or shoes or something like that, where you can watch and see what they're doing. Most business to business salespeople are doing it what? They're out in the field. They're not in an office. They're, they may not, their manager may not even be located in the same state that they're in. And so I think that's a great question for business or for sales management. Okay. And your last question.
My last one is, how do you make sure to have a good balance of core data and emotional connections?
Okay.
And our jurisdiction is that it shows how the salesperson is able to make a sale, feel personal while also being able to push numbers and data to convince the customer that they're making the right call.
Okay. All right. One of the things that we think about in business to business sales is that it's more rational than it is in business to consumer sales. Generally speaking, B2C sales are highly, highly, highly irrational. You buy stuff because it's there, because you see it and you have this desire and you have the money in your pocket and it's just burning a hole and you buy it. We generally think that B2B is more rational than that because they're not buying it for their own consumption or their own use. But is it completely rational? Is anybody ever completely rational? No, they're not. So I think that's a great question, particularly with regard to, you can say, is this in a B2B context? If you're interviewing somebody who's doing B2B, what percentage of it is emotional? And what percentage of it is relationship building? And I think that's a great follow-up. All right. You guys are great. Good to go. Good questions. Let's see. Today is the 23rd. I gotta date these so that I have them all. Who wants to go next?
We do.
All right. And the group? What's the group name?
The back table.
The back table. All right. And your questions?
Okay, our first question is, how is success measured within the workplace? And this is a good question because obviously you want to be successful where you work at, and you want to know what you can see, like how to do that, and you want to know like the components, like A, B, and C, how do I succeed
Okay.
working here?
So I think that's a good question, particularly to understand what it is that they're looking at. And, for the most part in sales, success is going to be measured by what? How much you sell. However, in that, there can be a lot of variation in how much you sell. For example, some products have higher margins than others. What's generally in a lot of business to business sales, it's not just a product that you're selling, but it's also a service that goes along with that product. And what do you think has higher margins generally?
SaaS products.
The what?
SaaS products.
Okay, but if you have a product and a service, which do you think has a higher margin, the service or the product?
Service?
A lot of times it's service. Why do you think? So a lot of car dealers, this is a phenomenon that I've noticed. A lot of car dealers are now doing this thing, and I bought a car, and it's actually from a friend of mine. So I grew up. My best friend in high school was John Vance's stepson, and his younger son was my brother's best friend growing up. Like they knew each other from the time they were like 5 years old. And John Vance has John Vance Motors in Guthrie, and they have a car dealership in Perry. And so I grew up with the Vance family. And one of the things that I've noticed that they've done, I bought my last truck, I bought from John Vance Motors. And they have a deal where if you buy a new car from them, they have a lifetime powertrain warranty. If you get your if you get your oil changes and tires rotated at John Vance Motors. Why are they doing that? So if you come into the building My truck is sitting right out there. It's the big white dually, the 3500 that's right in front. It's a very obnoxious vehicle. I just love it. So why are they doing that? Well, if I go to a express lube place, the cost of getting that oil change is about half of what I'm going to pay at going to the car dealer itself. But I go to the car dealer so that I maintain that lifetime warranty. Now, why are they doing that? Because the margins, cars have gotten so expensive, new cars have gotten so expensive that the profit margins on the car sale itself are really, really small. But the profit margins on service are huge, right? I mean, it's huge. So what is, looking at those kinds of in your product line, how are you measuring these? Is there a difference in the variable compensation plans that you get for various products? All right, so I think that's a great question. Okay, your second question.
What are the 3 biggest things that'll help you improve in sales from this job? And the justification for that is companies always want evolving employees. You always want to try to improve yourself as well as the company.
Okay, I would agree with that.
Oh, you want me to go?
Yep.
Okay. How do you plan to evolve to stay relevant in the future? And it's good to know the goals to see how the goals of the company.
Okay, so this one you could split into 2 parts. How could you split it into 2 parts?
Like what are their goals for the future, and then like exactly like what else? Is there anything like that they plan on doing? Like, I mean, you can reach your goals like the company, but then also what else could they like a new product or something they can bring out so they can.
Right. So that's one part. You can, like, what is it that you plan to do? Where do you see your industry and company planning to evolve in the future? And it is, I mean, most things are not static. They are evolving. Even history, I oftentimes say that I wish I were a history professor because, as I pointed out, when I first started teaching, I had a piece of chalk. We had a piece of chalk and a textbook and a textbook, and that's the way you taught. You made outlines on the board, or you drew diagrams on the board, or something like that. You didn't have one of these. Now, the way I teach, why is it that I record this class? Well, I record it so that you all can see it, but we also use these videos in online education classes. So that's radically different. I wouldn't have thought about teaching. Online education was in its infancy when I started teaching. If you wanted to not come to class, how did you do it? Well, there was something called correspondence courses that we offered, and we had a whole office. And basically it was just, you got the textbook and the professor maybe gave you some materials, some outlines from his lecture or something like that. And then you came to campus and actually took tests. That's not the way it works today. And because I teach marketing, I have to keep up even more so than somebody who teaches, if your area of specialty and the class you teach is the American Civil War, well, we know what happened there, right? And I think that would be wonderful, but most businesses are not static. There are changes in the industry. So I think that's part A of the question, but also you can make it more personal. And how does the salesperson plan to stay relevant within the sales field? If you're having to constantly evolve, if you're selling something other than a product that's, fairly well established and defined, how do you personally have to? What are the challenges in terms of technology and keeping up with technology in business that are relevant? Okay, good question. The fourth question?
The fourth one has to do with values. Like what do you value out of a product, or what do you value as a corporate, as a company? That's really important on multiple fronts. Like if you're like in a job interview, that helps you know that the values of the company align with your own.
And then if you're trying to sell something to someone, it's really helpful because if you know their values, like what they value above other things, you know, like you can kind of tailor the approach of how you sell your product, or you can tailor which products you show them. Like with clothes or like shoes or something like that. You know, they like flashy, but they don't care about comfort. You know, that you can highlight some of these other ones, like some of these make some products, and then discourage other ones.
Okay, I think this is particularly when we talk about ethics, which we'll talk about in this class, an excellent question from an ethics standpoint. There are companies that do have different values from other companies. So Zappos, for example, I teach ethics right before this class, in this classroom. And one of the things we were talking about in the ethics class today was Zappos, and they're putting their supply chain out there for the entire world to see. They let everybody know how they source their materials. Now, why is this important? Because consumers, particularly in your age group, are far more concerned about whether or not a company is using things like child labor or sweatshop type conditions than even my generation or my parents' generation. My parents' generation were concerned about, like, can I get it cheaper here or there? And, if there are people in India or China that are basically living in subsistence wages, well, sucks to be them, but I need my, textiles, I need my business suit, or I need my pants, or I need my sweater, and I want it at the cheapest price I can get it. Your generation, that's not so much true. So Zappos, by putting that out there, is indicating one of the values that they have, and that they're not going to source products from people that engage in unethical or what they perceive to be unethical practices in their supply chain. And so I think that's an excellent question in terms of particularly an ethics standpoint. And for those of you that are looking for a job, understanding that about the company, I think is going to be critical. One of the things that you all want is, unlike other generations, your generation does not live to work. You work to live. And that's a different mindset from, say, traditionalists who are your grandparents, where, it was like you got to work and you work hard, and your generation is I want to have work-life balance and things like that. And there are companies that to this day use that older model and don't have that kind of balance. So I think that's a great question. And it also, is a great question from a corporate standpoint, corporate social responsibility. All right, and your last question.
Okay, who is involved within the company contributing to development? The justification is good to know who's in charge of what and if you can contribute to.
Yeah, I think, again, that's a great question. Again, salespeople, and we talked about this, I think last time I touched on this in one of the other people's question. Salespeople are oftentimes the eyes and the ears of the company. They're the first ones to recognize trends in the market and be able to spot those trends and actually report back to the company and have a positive impact on what kinds of things the company is going to offer in their product lines and services. And so I think it's a great question. All right, good job. Who else needs to go? How many? Is that all the groups? Everybody's gone? All right. All right, so let me ask a question, and you can get bonus points, which will be added to your first exam scores if you talk and provide really plangent responses to the question today. Now, what you have to do in order to get this, you have to remember to come up and tell me that you provided an answer, because after this class is over, I won't remember that you talked to me. So be sure and come up and say, I talked to you, my name is, because I'm learning your names so that I will give you the points in the first exam. So I add bonus points to each exam period that we're on. So this will be added to the first exam period if you answer. The world has changed, as I've said just a few moments ago, with regard to teaching. When I first started teaching, we had not these things, we had chalkboards, which I wish we would go back to, because chalkboards are actually a far superior product to this for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is that my handwriting is really god awful, and students could read my handwriting on a chalkboard because chalk is not slick, and so you have to slow down and you can't write really fast. Whereas with these, you can, write really, really fast and just all over the place, and it's hard to tell what it is that I'm writing half the time, and students will be like, what does that say? So it's changed a lot. We didn't have these things when I started teaching, and we didn't have PowerPoint. That's a relatively new thing. I know that that's news to a lot of you in here, but we didn't have PowerPoint. Like I said, we had a textbook and a piece of chalk, and if you were really sophisticated, you went and you typed up on a typewriter, because a lot of people didn't have computers when I started teaching in their offices. They were really expensive, and we had to share computers. They'd have to go to a computer lab. People would type up, or they would handwrite if they were a math professor, handwrite out problems on a sheet of paper, and then you would take that sheet of paper, you would put it in a copy machine, and you would run a transparency through the copy machine that would take a copy of it. And then you would take your transparency and you would lay it on an overhead projector and project it up onto the screen. And that's the way we did things. And if you wanted to show a video in marketing, I had to go get a TV card and this thing that you've never even seen called a VHS. How many of you have actually seen a VHS cassette? Oh my gosh. You've actually seen this thing. I bet you have not seen the Betamax cassette. I actually had beta tapes when I first started teaching. You don't even know what a Betamax is, do you? So before there were VHS, there was this, Sony came out with Betamax. They were the first ones to come out with this thing. And they lost out on the market. They wouldn't license it. And so other companies came up with a competing product that could get around the patents, and it became the VHS tape, which was smaller than a Betamax tape. And so, I had to go get this TV card if I wanted to show things. Now, one of the great things about marketing is I can pull up a commercial on the internet and play it without having to go get a TV or anything like that. Just play it in class, and we're off to the races. So given that we've had these radical changes in almost everything, when I started teaching, I couldn't have imagined having an online class. How did you do that? You had correspondence. So given that we've changed radically, is an understanding of the history of a discipline relevant to sales today? Is understanding the history of sales relevant, or should we just skip learning about the history of the past and move right on? So yes, you have
I say yes because there's still like an older generation that we can kind of appeal to.
So because there's an older generation, how so? Is that relevant?
Like I had a professor that still used the projector and stuff like that. So like
you actually had a professor that still used overhead projection?
Dr. Ness.
For what?
Yeah. She used to teach textiles and she would show us patterns on fabrics and stuff like that, the weaves, and she would literally pull out and she had those clear papers with the drawings on it. She used it. Yep.
It's still a popular way of using professors to show music on screen. She's a music.
I learned good with the
Yeah.
projector.
Me too.
I didn't.
I'm horrified.
I love that class.
Not I.
Yeah.
She actually
I
had an
hated her.
overhead projector and transparency.
Mhm.
She retired like this year, but
There's this thing called the internet. I'd be willing to bet.
I don't know.
She's really old school.
Yeah.
I'd be willing to bet that if we,
And here at UCO,
for example,
You could see the weave lines with it though.
so
on
let's
the
say-
projector.
Yeah.
That's the main point. You can
she
see,
showed
like,
us
those
that
are
on the
weave
projector.
lines.
She showed us that on the projector.
herringbone pattern.
Yeah, we
This
would
is-
draw them ourselves, and she would draw them on the projector sometimes.
Yeah.
She had like the dry erase markers and did it on there and everything.
Look, I mean, you can find.
I don't know.
Yeah.
She showed us that on a projector.
Why would you can,
I don't know. It made it more personal, and you went down step by step through it on learning how those are made and stuff like that. It worked with textiles, I think.
Yeah, we also had a book with the actual text on it too.
I think as far as that, it would also work with.
well, there's this modern invention called a webcam that should be, like, we have in a document cam. We have them, they're in the, if you have 113, if you've heard a class in Troy Smith, we actually have a document cam in there and you can write on it. And they now have these things in some colleges called smart boards that you can write on. And it will,
Yeah, some professors don't even know how to use those or set them up.
Maybe they should.
You just prefer the overhead cam.
maybe they should learn. So.
I mean, she retired, so I mean, like Dr. Ness did, so it's fine.
But apparently she was still here until this year.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had her
Well,
last
really
year.
last year. Because
Yeah.
it's 20 now.
Oh, yeah. I think her last semester was spring 2019.
Yeah.
Or no, she was teaching in the summer because I had her in summer. So
Okay, all right. So you're saying that because there's an older generation and they still buy stuff, that it's necessary to understand sort of a history of it because we still have people out there that are
like I have a friend that sells makeup,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of her clients are like an older
Uh-huh.
generation. Like they still do the old school. Come
does she
in.
sell Avon?
No.
What does she sell?
She sells Estee Lauder.
She sells Estee Lauder.
Mhm.
They have this thing called the mall. I'm like, I think they sell Estee Lauder at Dillard's, don't they? Avon is still sold that way, like pretty much like it's door-to-door sales. They actually still have. I have an elderly friend of my grandmother's who was an Avon representative, and she still takes little catalogs to all of the little ladies in her little area that she sells to, and actually sells door-to-door. So, okay, so there are still a big population, and in fact, that population
Has money.
is pretty big.
Oh.
And they have money, yes. They one of the biggest transfers of wealth has been from, historically speaking, if you went back in time, people who had money were younger people because they were working. And when you retired, hopefully before throw you down the well or do something like that with you, because you weren't an economic, but once we got Social Security and retirement and things like that, the biggest transfer of wealth has actually been from the young to the old. And so old people actually have a lot of money. I mean, that generation, they tended to save more than your generation does. Your generation is not good at saving. So yeah, that they absolutely, that's a valid point that there are still a lot of people that this is completely foreign. They don't, they still may have landlines. They don't have this, or if they have this, I have a friend who still has a flip phone. He's 76, and it took a lot to get him to get to the flip phone. But he has a flip phone. Okay.
I know that with like my line of work, the 80% of the people I cater to are 50s and 60s and up.
Okay.
And so it's really good to know, like, so I work at Harley Davidson, and a lot of people that I talk to are like, it's really good to know the history of the motorcycles, where they came from, who started it. It's good to know like what kind of riding gear and helmets that they prefer, like the materials that it's all made from. That way you can actually have a connection and build rapport with the customers and be able to assist them with all of that.
Okay, so you think that a history of a discipline is important because again, it's a connection. And then you've provided a specific example, which is Harley Davidson, which people have a real emotional connection to. People who buy a Harley because they have this emotional.
It's their way of life.
Right. I mean, it is a lifestyle
Yes.
for those people. And it's not as popular among your generation. So Harley actually has, as I understand it, a line of motorcycle that is more popular. It's called Ducati. Is that right?
They created an electric bike.
Okay.
And it's not sold in a whole lot of dealerships because it's more expensive to house in the dealership than it actually bringing in money.
Okay. What's the line? Did you say Ducati?
Yeah.
Isn't that's a Harley product, isn't it?
Partnered with.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, it's not Harley branded, but they are.
Right.
I mean, they own a significant percentage.
Yes.
And that's so Harley, as I understand it, I don't know, but Harley doesn't make sort of the race bikes, right? And
No, they're more of like the luxury.
as luxury
have,
as you can get with,
Yes.
right. And they're more of a big engine, like touring,
Yes.
bike,
Yes.
right? And then
Absolutely.
motorcycles come in a variety, and there's these little racing bikes, and that's the other line. They're usually sold, I've noticed, in Harley dealers, right? That bike is. So yeah, company helps in, so a lot of the styling of Harleys hasn't changed a whole lot over time. And people who like that style and things like that, they probably even know. One of my friends, he is a car fanatic, but not new. I mean, new cars, it's hard. They all look the same. One of the things that's really, I think, odd is that you can't tell one car, like a Hyundai SUV looks like an Audi. I mean, you used to be able to tell, when I was a kid growing up, you could tell a Mercedes from a mile away. It was a big, boxy car that had this beautiful emblem that stuck up from the hood, and it was a distinctive car. It's hard to tell the Mercedes. I was going through the mall the other day, and it's hard to tell. I was behind. There were two white SUVs in the parking lot as I was pulling in. One was a Mazda CX-5 and the other was a Mercedes. And if you didn't get right up on them, you couldn't tell the difference from the back. Now, from the front, you could sort of tell the difference because they have a different, but they're not any distinction in the styles. But people who like cars, particularly older cars, they know what model something was, what year they changed headlights, for example. And I would think Harley would be the same thing.
Yeah.
Indian motorcycle is another one that people have. It's an emotional attachment to it. It's not just in terms of the usefulness or the utility of the product. So you've given good examples. All right.
To talk a little bit more to hers, it's kind of the same where I work because it's harder for me to transition an older guy who wants a Serato 1500 into looking at even a GMC or a Ford F-150 because they've had Seratos the entire life. So like, oh, I know all about it. I know the motor. I know all this, and this. So if I'm like, hey, look at this. This is different. It's almost the exact same features. It's a little bit newer and cheaper. Like, no, this is what I want just because of that.
They're very brand loyal.
Yeah.
Okay. And so from a sales perspective and a marketing perspective, I think that's one of the things that is important to understand about history is that branding itself and understanding the history of branding is important in sales. Brands have power, right? And people identify, as you acknowledge, with Harley or with Chevy Silverado. They identify with the brand, and understanding the power of branding is important. And to understand the power of branding, you have to have some appreciation of the history of branding and how brands got developed and what a brand means. And in fact, how we protect brands. That's important. So brands are intellectual property. You can own them. And they have value. Forever and ever and ever, they estimate, there are people who estimate the value of a brand. And Coca-Cola was forever and ever and ever estimated to be the most valuable brand in the world. Why is that? Because Coca-Cola was almost everywhere. It was the first product when Richard Nixon in 1973 went to China and opened communist China. The first product that the United States exported to China was Coca-Cola, which is all that is good and pure and American is Coca-Cola. Unlike Pepsi, which is a communist, inferior brand. So Coca-Cola is, now I think other brands surpass Coca-Cola in terms of their value, but it's an iconic brand. And so understanding that I think is important, and understanding the history of brands. Who else has?
I wanted to, what he was talking about with like brand loyalty and stuff like that. I've noticed where I work, I sell makeup. It doesn't matter how old or young you are.
Mm-hmm.
If someone comes in and you don't have that product, more often than not, they're like, oh, well, I'm sticking with that product. I'll go to another store. Like they're willing to drive all the way to Quail Springs Mall to go get that certain product. And I just find it weird sometimes. Maybe because I test out a lot of things, but
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay, so again, and there are products that understanding sort of a history of how we got here is important, because the product itself is, and the uses to which the product, and understand it's hard to sell. Maybe makeup, I told you all that I now buy my shirts online because there's a company that I know makes shirts that will fit me, and I don't have to go and try them on like I used to think that I had to. And so I haven't bought a shirt in a store in 6 or 7 years now.
Wow.
And so, but makeup, I don't know.
It's like an instant gratification thing. You can buy it online no matter what, and a lot of people do. But I've come to find that if someone buys it, they want to try it out that day. They want to know if that will work for them that day, or if not, then they'll return it, or they use it until the very, very end, and then they need it right then.
Right. Which actually they probably shouldn't do with makeup, because one of the things that they tell you from a health standpoint that you should, and it's expensive, so people don't want to do this, you should throw all of your makeup away. I think one of the studies I read suggested that at least every 6 months, particularly anything that you put around your eyes, you should throw away.
They all have an expiration date on them. They say they're like 6 or 12 months on them.
Nobody ever.
But whenever you get sick, you're also supposed to buy new makeup.
What?
Or if someone else uses like your eyeliner or mascara, get a new one.
It's a really good way to get pink eye.
Ew, yeah.
It's,
I don't share my
if
makeup.
you share stuff, okay?
Understanding like cultural differences, like how to approach someone and what to say, what not to say.
So yeah, this is another important thing in understanding. Culture is one of those things that evolve over time. Culture doesn't just spring forth like Venus from the foam. You don't recognize that reference because you didn't remember from your humanities course that Venus is a Greek god. She's a Greek goddess, right? And how was she born? Well, she was born of the foam. And so culture is one of these things that's organic. It takes a long time to develop and organize. And so it's important to understand culture. And in order to understand culture, you have to understand something about the history of things. And so I think these are all really good examples. And really, one of the reasons that it is important to understand the history of marketing thought in terms of where we are and how we got here. And so it also is important to understand the history of marketing from a philosophical standpoint, because the way companies operate impacts the way they sell. And so history often corresponds with philosophical movements. And so what we see in the history of marketing thought is a development of philosophies, and generally these philosophies emerge and they lead to new philosophies. So if we think about things in terms of a Hegelian dialectic, and you all probably don't remember who Hegel is from your humanities courses, but Hegel said that the way we proceed and the way we develop is through this dialectic process. And so it starts with a thesis. And what's a thesis? Well, a thesis is an idea. So you have a thesis, right, which is an idea, or maybe what we call a paradigm, a way of understanding things, a way of doing things. And there are various levels of philosophical development. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if you take philosophy courses, and I would probably be scolded by my colleagues over in the humanities and philosophy department for trying to distill this idea of philosophy down into a very short lecture in this class for purposes of the sales students. So they would probably disagree or say I'm missing things in terms of this. But the way I sort of think of things and organize them is there are what we might call grand level philosophies, overarching philosophies about how we understand the world, right? And then there are sort of what I call mid-range philosophies. And when we talk about the philosophies of sales and marketing, that's what we're talking about. Generally, these sort of mid-range philosophies that tell us about how we understand things in maybe a specific context, not the grand world view. What are those sort of grand philosophies? Those grand philosophies are things that answer questions like the question of knowledge, and we'll talk about this when we talk about ethics. What is it I can know and how can I know it? The question of conduct, what is ethical, what's not, how should I behave? And then the question of governance, how should we organize ourselves? And so great philosophers deal with these three questions. The first Western philosopher to come up with a fully fleshed out philosophy on this was probably Socrates, who we know about from his most famous student, Plato. And I'll touch a little bit on that in ethics. But so we're going to deal with sort of mid-range or mid-level philosophies that explain how things work in, for example, the market economy. So the first of these is what we call a production philosophy. So there's this thesis, which we'll call a production philosophy. In relationship to that, you'll have an antithesis. And if that sticks around long enough, that antithesis will become a thesis in and of itself. And then from these, you often get a synthesis, right? So the first philosophy is the production era philosophy in sales and marketing. And as a discipline, as an academic pursuit, marketing is very young. And the sales discipline as an academic pursuit is even younger within sort of the framework of marketing. But as a life activity, marketing has ancient roots. It goes back to the earliest civilizations. And we see the emergence of marketing. So for most of recorded history, till about 1920, we have this production philosophy, or what we call the production era. And I use a movie, a theme from a movie called Field of Dreams. How many of you have seen it? It's a very old movie now. It's a sports movie, but lots of people still see it because sports movies have a tendency to have followings, and so even young people will see them. If you are for it, they will come. So Kevin Costner builds, it is Kevin Costner, right? I think that's right. If I remember correctly, he's the main star. What? You don't know the name. I'm pretty sure it's Kevin Costner. Builds this baseball diamond out in the middle of a cornfield. I don't know that they ever tell you which state it's in, but it's probably Iowa, because that's where they produce a lot of corn. And these players from the cornfield just sort of show up and play. If you build it, they will come. And this, for most of human history, was the way business operated. If I built something, I could probably sell it. If it was at all useful, I could probably, so as we emerged from what we might call the primitive psyche into organized societies, and we don't know where the first organized society was, but once we did that, what you started to see was a division of labor among people, and they started doing, so I started specializing in certain things. I would have a cow and you have chickens, you want milk it's highlighted by the barter system to begin with. You have chickens, I have a cow, you want milk, I want eggs. I will trade you milk for eggs. Right? So barter. And why do I say this went to about 1920? Well, because prior to 1920, goods and services were pretty scarce. They were produced generally on smaller scales, not in huge production runs. And if I had something, I didn't have to do a lot of what we think of as modern marketing to sell it. If I have chickens, people need eggs, people had cows, you need milk. And so I didn't have to market that. That's not true in what is now the postmodern era, is it? Can I just sell my milk? If I have Bossy and Flossie the cow out there, can I just go out there? Well, I'm probably going to go broke if I'm going out there, Although there are people who are now making a living off of having micro farms and producing locally, and it's very expensive, but it's and there's whole food movements that have gone back to this idea. So if you've ever been to a restaurant down on Broadway in the Automobile Alley district of Oklahoma City called Cultivar, anybody been to Cultivar? What's Cultivar's big theme? That they are,
It's all organic and
locally sourced, farm to table. So the idea is that at least for most of their products, they know where they're getting it. They're buying it locally and sourcing it locally. So there is this movement, but that's a very small movement. So if you build it, they will come. If I have something and I put it out there, you'll probably buy it and not complain too much about it because there isn't a whole lot of competition. When Henry Ford developed the Model T car, now Henry Ford didn't develop the first automobile, right? There were other people who had automobiles, right? But they were largely novelties at the time he developed them. They were largely for the very wealthy, and they were built, in small, specialized numbers for very wealthy people. Henry Ford comes along and says, wow, this is the future. This thing that is the major mode of transportation that people are using, called a horse. Well, what's wrong with it? Slow. I grew up on a cattle ranch in northern New Mexico, so I know a lot about horses. What are some of the other problems with horses?
Sanitation problems.
There's sanitation problems. Yeah, as we started having more and more people living in the city, this horse stuff, lying around, that creates maybe a problem from a sanitation standpoint. They're also living creatures, which means that they're high maintenance. They get sick. They die. What else?
They can only
Yeah,
travel
feed
about
'em.
15 or 20 miles a day.
Yeah, they can only travel. Why is it that we have so for those of you who are, anybody, how many of you are from native Oklahomans? Only a few of you. How many of you went to high school in Oklahoma? Okay, almost everybody. So not all of you are native Oklahomans, but some of you went to high school in Oklahoma. I actually went to high school in Oklahoma. So I had to take a horrible course that was really boring called Oklahoma history. We took Oklahoma history.
I love
Everybody had to
Oklahoma
take
history.
Yeah, we all have to take Oklahoma history. Continent that anybody wanted to fight about, right? I mean, it's smack dab in the middle of the country. It's kind of hot in the summer and miserable and cold in the winter. And so it's the last place anybody really wanted to fight about. And the history of Oklahoma is not terribly interesting from a lot of people. But one of the things that you probably had to learn in that course is that we have a huge number of counties in Oklahoma. And for those of you who had Oklahoma history, how many counties do we have in Oklahoma? You forgot because you slept since then. 77. 77. We have 77 counties in Oklahoma. Why do we have 77 counties in Oklahoma? Well, because when Oklahoma was settled, people were still using horses. Back in Oklahoma was founded in 1907. That's the year of statehood. People still rode horses at a lot of places, and they had 77 counties because you had to be able to get to the county seat to transact business back in 1907. And they didn't want it to be more than half a day's ride from any place in the county. So you could get to the county seat in any county within about half a day's ride, so that you could get to the county seat, transact business, and then what? Ride home, in theory. So we have 77 counties in Oklahoma, and that's an example. And horses were necessary, but they're slow, they stink. My friend Robert, who I finally got on a horse after years and years and years of trying to persuade him, insists that they're dangerous animals. I mean, he's just convinced that the horse is going to kill you. And in fact, they can be dangerous animals. And they can throw you off. So Henry Ford doesn't build the first car, but he's the first one to mass produce the car. And the saying goes that you could have a Model T Ford in any color you wanted, so long as that color was black. Right? All of the Ford Model Ts came off. There were no pearl white. There was no racing red. There was no burnt orange. They were all black. How many of you would buy a car if the only color you could have was black? You live in Oklahoma. Black is a horrible color for a car in Oklahoma. It's
only in the summer.
Hot. Oh no, it's horrible all year round. Black shows dirt. We have this stuff in Oklahoma called red dirt. And in fact, there's a whole country and western music genre called red dirt country that originated in Oklahoma and is exemplified by bands like Cross Canadian Ragweed, for those of you who are, So it's horrible. In the wintertime or in the spring when it rains, that red mud, if you have a black car, shows up. And even if it's dry as a bone, well, the wind blows and that red mud shows up on your, I mean, I wouldn't, you couldn't pay me to take a black car in Oklahoma. But some of you apparently, haven't thought this through.
What other color?
White. All cars should be white.
What? That's literally gonna get dirty too.
It doesn't show. It's not the same.
I have a silver car and I got a ticket once and they wrote that I was a gold car because my car was dirty.
White is the best color because it reflects the most amount of sun in the summertime. Because white is the absence of color, and so it reflects the most amount. It's the coolest color, and it shows the least amount of dirt. And when it oxidizes from our good Oklahoma sun, you can't tell the difference. Whereas if you have a red car or a black car or any other color car and it oxidizes, you're stuck with this oxidized car. If it's white, oxidized white is still white. It's sitting right out front. It's a big white. It's white. Right, so you should have white cars. So you wouldn't accept this today, but because it was so much better than the alternative, you could see why people would do that. They would buy that. You didn't have to sell it. It wasn't a hard sell because it was better than what came before, which was the horse. That starts to change in the 1920s. Now, when we talk about these philosophies, there are still companies that use this philosophy. Microsoft is an example of a company that still uses a production philosophy. Microsoft pumps out crappy operating systems, and we all still buy it because what? They have the largest market share. Microsoft it's a horrible company. They started out with a crappy operating system. Bill Gates foisted off. It was called DOS, and DOS originally, that was the first one that they developed. They didn't really develop it. They bought it from somebody and sort of tweaked it. And DOS actually, I think, initially stood for like dirty operating system because it was a down and dirty operating, and then it changed to digital operating system, right? So they had this thing called DOS. It was horrible, but they captured, because they were new in the market, they managed to capture the vast majority of the market share. Now, what we're going to see, interestingly enough, is we have for the first time in a long time in our history the ability to watch a nascent industry develop and see what happens, and that's the marijuana industry in Oklahoma, because there isn't a Microsoft out there, right? But Microsoft still controls. Now they have nowhere to go but down, and so a lot of people are switching over to different operating systems, particularly as we're doing more and more stuff. We're not so much using computers, we're doing more and more stuff on this, and so these platforms are becoming more and more prevalent. But Microsoft still has a huge percentage of market share. They are a production. They don't do research, a whole lot of research on what people want. They just pump product out there. And how many of them have been complete and utter failures? Any of you remember, you're probably too young to really remember this, but any of you remember Windows Vista? It was horrible. It was a nightmare. Microsoft is a production. Apple under Steve Jobs was another company that operated with a production. Steve Jobs' philosophy was, you don't know what's cool. I'm the arbiter of what's cool. I'll tell you what's cool and you will buy it.
Wow.
And we have, right? I mean, we did. How many of you have an iPhone?
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of you in this class have an iPhone. Because Steve Jobs didn't do any marketing research. He didn't do any science. It's just, this is what's cool. I'm going to tell you what's cool. You'll buy it. I am out of time. We'll finish this up and we'll have a critical thinking challenge next time on marketing, science, or art. And if you would turn in your questions both to the discussion board so your colleagues can see them, and then to the Dropbox so that I can give you a grade, so that it will populate into the grade book on D2L. I would appreciate it enormously. Thank you. And I will see you all on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
All right, Professor, I'm here for my bonus point credits.
Yeah, if you talk, be sure and come up. Let me get this to end. Why is it not ending?
Group chat on me or Snapchat?
Oh, let's do. I don't like GroupMe. I don't.